Good evening, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Yes, I'm not sure if this mic is doing anything. If it's not, I'll project. My name is Olesa Kromachuk. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. We're an independent charity that champions Ukrainian culture and shapes the conversation about Ukraine in the UK and beyond. And it's my great honor to welcome you to UCL on behalf of 3 institutions that have organized tonight's event. That's the UIL, Ukrainian Institute London, the UCL European Institute, and the UCL Department of Political Science that is holding this discussion as part of their policy and practice series. And in fact, the next session within this series will take place on Thursday, 23rd of January, and it's entitled Decarbonizing the Power System. So you can already sign up for it via the department's website and Eventbrite. Tonight's discussion, including the Q&A, is being recorded. So if you are going to speak during the questions and answers, you will be recorded. Bear that in mind, and we will share the recording on our YouTube channels and on social media. And if you haven't followed the 3 institutions that are co-organizing this event on social media, please do so, and please tag us if you have something to say about this event. Also, we are taking photos tonight, so if you don't want to appear in them, wave to a member of our team or to the photographer, and we'll make sure we respect your desire. Now, we are talking tonight about a very pressing matter of European security in the aftermath of the US elections, with a fantastic panel of speakers, and our wonderful moderator will introduce them in a moment. As it happens, one of the speakers is not able to join us in person and instead joining us via Zoom online, well, because his visa was not issued in time to travel out of Ukraine. And I find this episode really quite telling, because when we talk about security in Europe, perhaps it's worth bearing in mind that there's more than one Europe. There's Europe protected by security of political and military alliances, and there's Europe that has been so frequently left to its own devices to protect its territorial integrity, its land, its people. And those in the latter Europe aren't always freely allowed to enter the former Europe. Unity is key for security. Alliances are key for security. Solidarity is key for security. And knowledge is key for security. And while I am not sure if we'll be able to solve all of the dilemmas of European security tonight, I really do hope that we'll acquire an improved knowledge that we need to understand how we can contribute to this more secure future in these highly volatile times. So it is my great pleasure to now pass the mic to the moderator of this event, Senior International Affairs Correspondent at The Guardian, Emma Graham-Harrison.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to be here. I'm also thrilled to and excited to hear what our panel have got to say. We have, I'll start with Mykola. Mykola Bieleskov, senior analyst at the National Institute for Strategic Studies, which is part of Ukraine's military policy department. And he's also a senior analyst at the NGO Come Back Alive, which supports the Ukrainian military. Here in the room, we have Dr. Lindsay Newman, a geopolitical risk expert, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a former senior research fellow at Chatham House. Her recent positions include practice head of global macro geopolitics at Eurasia Group and head of geopolitical thought leadership with S&P Global. And Sir David Lidington, who is chair of RUSI, one of the UK's leading security and defence policy think tanks. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with it, and former Deputy Prime Minister. So his time on the front lines of international politics are particularly relevant tonight, including posts as Minister for Europe and representing the UK at EU, NATO, UN Security Council, among other international gatherings. We're here at a sort of fascinating, some people might say alarming time. It's the eve of Donald Trump's second term. And pretty much today, the last couple of days, we've seen already, he's not even taken power, his impact on international relations with the pending, probably going to be approved tomorrow, ceasefire in Gaza. Obviously, that is particularly relevant for Ukraine because he began his campaign saying he would end the war there in 24 hours. Lindsay pointed out he's now slightly realigned that timeline to within 6 months. But nonetheless, he's made clear that he sort of means business, his unpredictability, his willingness to use force. So we're going to start out by talking about what his administration is going to mean for Ukraine and the war there, and then expand from there to look at the broader questions from Europe. So particularly because I think it's good to start with Mykolas, he's actually on the ground, also because of risks of losing the connection. I wondered if you could just tell us a bit about the view from Ukraine, because obviously for most people talking about this, it's a sort of abstract question of geopolitics, but for you, Trump's promise to end the war without really saying how he plans to do that or what the price will be is a matter of life and death and your future, the future of the people you love, your friends, your work, and your whole country. So, how are Ukrainians feeling about the new administration and Trump and what he's saying or threatening, perhaps depending on your perspective, to do about Ukraine?
Good evening, everyone. Hope you can hear me. If yes, please nod. Lovely, lovely. Thank you. I'll start maybe with a paradoxical thought, but comparing with 2016, 2017, with the first Trump administration, there is less emotion, there is less dramatism, paradoxically, because situation changed and changed in a negative way for Ukraine. But I don't see the same kind of exasperation, the same kind of gloom and doom that was evident in 2016, 2017, when Trump was about to become president of the US for the first time. We can discuss why it is so, though different opinions, different ideas come from him, from his team, very diverse coalition. But right here, right now, along with the fact that we did our best to make our case in front of the Trump, in front of his team, we are still do not know the nuances of his approach. Only recently we've seen some statements, including from the people who are going to be part of his team, like Marco Rubio as a future Secretary of State, that some kind of compromise should be, all should need to make concessions, including US, as Marco Rubio said just yesterday. And everything else, it's just, we are patiently waiting as everyone else, 20th of January, the composition of team and proper, more meaningful statements to then respond properly. So that's how people respond to incoming Trump administration. And in general, it's less gloom and doom as it was.
And I mean, Lindsay, coming to you, we've seen in Gaza, Trump has very effectively sort of used his leverage. When it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, the situation on the ground, you have Russian forces sort of grinding forward across the east, apparently, disregard for the lives of their own soldiers and their capacity to sort of recruit, sometimes, forcibly, to make deals with North Korea means that they do seem to have a sort of endless supply of people to throw at this very brutal, grim form of warfare. Putin's already sunk a lot into this war. Like, looking at it from an American perspective, do you think his promise or commitment to somehow end the conflict within 6 months, is that realistic? Does he have leverage, and how will he deploy it?
Thank you, Emma. Thank you all for having me here. Yeah, as you said from the start, throughout the campaign trail, President-elect Donald Trump committed to ending the war within 24 hours. He was pressed on this and, of course, said, I have ideas around a plan. I don't have a plan, but he's now, just in the last week's time, extended that deadline to 6 months with the realization that, in fact, the 24 hours in office is upon him, and he probably still does not have a concrete plan there. We saw today, as Michaela was saying, yesterday, that Marco Rubio has made it clear that there is expectations around where the sort of end result could be, in the sense that Russia is not going to, in fact, march all of its troops out of Ukraine. And that was probably a startling thing to hear from many people, that the likely incoming Secretary of State is now going on record of saying that Ukrainian territory is not going to be we're not going back to something. He's officially taking that line. For Donald Trump, the viewpoint through which he's seeing this is, he said very clearly, this would have never happened. Russia would have never invaded Ukraine had the US troops, had Biden not pulled out of Afghanistan. That's the viewpoint through which he sees the entire conflict. And that the sense that there was a weakening perception of the US in the world, and he's coming back to bring this golden era of the US again. And what we know is behavior, attitudes are shifting just from the news of November 6th, November 7th, the realization that Donald Trump has been reelected. Zelensky has said he has now found this willingness to negotiate. Putin has even come on record and said he has a willingness to join talks. This was not the approach that we saw under the Biden administration. And that's the leverage. Those are the points of leverage. By using these multiple tools of threatening around funding, or what's going to be available on funding, what's going to be available on attitudes within the US security community, it shifts the dial, it shifts the needle, and is creating attitudinal and behavioral changes within the leadership in Ukraine and Russia. And those are the points of leverage for him.
David, I mean, I was in Ukraine a couple of months ago. Of course, there are many people for whom the loss of a part of Ukrainian territory is inconceivable, but I also spoke to people who felt that, you know, the war had gone on for a long time, Ukraine was paying a terrible price. If Ukraine could get real security guarantees, then they would maybe not welcome, but at least accept some sort of ceasefire that involved concession of territory. But of course, they have a very real concern. Putin has a long track record of breaking his own agreements, you know, particularly when it comes to Ukraine, the Minsk Accord, which was meant to resolve what was then the initial Russian invasion in 2014 via proxy forces of the Donbass. So what do you think? Obviously, Ukraine says it wants to be a member of NATO. I think it's pretty clear to most people that's not going to happen in the short term. You know, the sort of overlap between what people can do, what they can afford to do. You've been at those negotiating tables. What do you think Ukraine might be able to get that would give it security short of being part of NATO? How might that work? What could it expect from Europe?
I think we're in a very perilous position, both for not only for Ukraine's security, Ukraine's effective sovereignty, but for European security more generally. I think, as Lindsay said, European powers, including Ukrainian leadership, are adapting to the reality, what they fear about Trump. I still hope that Trump, and maybe the 6 months talk is now indication of this, it gets the fact that anything that is seen as a capitulation by Ukraine to Russian power will be seen globally as a defeat for the United States and for the West, that will follow Iraq, that will follow Kabul, and be further evidence that people cannot trust the US to stick by its friends, and that Putin's persistence is what they need to take as realpolitik. I think it will actually add to the risk of nuclear proliferation as well, because the lesson will be, if you give up your nuclear weapons, as Ukraine did, then you have no protection against bullying by a nuclear power, Russia. Whereas if you have your illicit nuclear program, then like Kim Jong-un, you will have your summit meeting with the President of the United States, and they will not dare to attack you. So I think there are real perils in terms of global stability, in particular European stability, where Russia's attempted subversion of elections in Romania and in the Western Balkans, the cyber attacks on Estonia in particular, but here as well, the attacks on subsea interconnectors and cables are continuing all the time. So I hope that President Trump and his team get the fact that what they need to do in American interests is to have a situation where Ukrainian sovereignty and self-determination is real. My fear is that Putin is not remotely interested in any sort of real compromise. Putin's objective has been the subjugation of Ukraine at a minimum. We know from what he said and written, he does not believe in Ukrainian nationhood as a thing. He believes they're really Russians with false consciousness of that identity. He is said to have, by people who visited him, to have a bust of Catherine the Great in his office, and Catherine the Great was the Tsarina who extended Russian control over those parts of what is now Ukraine right through to Odessa and on the Black Sea coast. So my fear is that he will try to play the Americans as he played the Europeans successfully after the invasion of Crimea with the Minsk agreement and the Normandy process, which you look back and very clearly he reorganized, bided his time, waited for his opportunity, and then struck in February 2022. So I hope that the US will see that US interests are and reputation are seriously at stake here. In interest, actually, more than reputation are at stake here. But I am really worried about where we stand today, because I think the risks to all our security are very grave.
I mean, Mykola, coming back to you, what do you think, Ukrainians, of course, I know publicly people are calling to be accepted into NATO, but what do you think Ukraine needs, or, what are the people you talk to saying that Ukraine would need to sort of have a ceasefire in which the loss of territory did mean, as much as these things ever can, real security to start rebuilding as part of Europe?
First of all, maybe I'd like to respond to one thing that was said. Unfortunately, between Biden and Trump administration incoming, there is a difference in the tone, but not in the substance about the end games they'd like to have. You'll never find a single statement out of the the Biden team, I'm sorry, that would say that Ukraine to recover all of its lost territories mean Ukraine victory. So in this case, there is unfortunately an agreement which do not favor UN Charter in terms of what is favorable end game for the US. And the outcoming administration always said that Ukraine just preserved as a sovereign independent state controlling 82% of its territories, which now controls, mean victory. And by this deny Russian theory of victory, which want to obliterate Ukrainian statehood, Ukrainian nation, as it was mentioned. So as for me, there is only the change of the style, but not of the substance. And then, of course, the issue of the guarantees, because Ukraine is traumatized by the Budapest Memorandum, bilateral agreements, multilateral agreements, and Minsk I, Minsk II agreements. And we emphasize security commitments, security guarantees to make the settlement durable. But first, to make the settlement happen, we need to stop Russia, because now Russia proceeds from the assumptions that they create new reality on the ground based on their military capabilities. So first, we need to arrest Russian advances, stabilize the front line, and then only the credible long-term commitment to Western support to Ukraine can persuade Putin to change his calculation. If it's not NATO membership, though, we would never revoke NATO membership goal. If it's not NATO membership, then it means as much substance as possible to these bilateral agreements we've signed during the last year. And by this, I mean statements supported by the money. Because if it's not Article 5, then it's conditions and clauses supported by the money, which can translate in weaponry, in training, in intelligence, and in everything else to basically make the settlement durable, because otherwise there is no rationale for Ukraine to agree with this. Because basically, if it's not agreement framework supported by credible commitment, security commitments, then it's just stretched in time agony for Ukraine, basically, because Putin would do everything to prevent successful reconstruction. He would scare people, capital, technology out of Ukraine and create another conditions in 3, 5, 7 years for another land grab, which might be mortal. Because first we lost 7% of our territory, Then we lost another 11-12% of the territory. So what would happen next time if we won't create some solid guardrails? So basically, it's credible security guarantees supported by money, supported by the long-term commitment to change Putin calculus and to send basically Putin the signal that Ukraine is here to stay and West is here to stay with Ukraine.
Yeah, of course you want to.
I mean, just on I mean, I agree with what Mikola said there. I just think on guarantees, there are some really big questions that could come down the line quickly to Britain, France, Germany, the other main European powers. If there is some sort of true ceasefire settlement, are we prepared to deploy troops? You know, as a border, it's a tripwire force to stop the Russians from trying further what they did in 2013 and 2022. If we're not prepared to do it, who are we expecting to do it in our stead? And there's, you know, are the Europeans going to grow up as security players? But with Russia, we're talking about a nuclear power. And is there credible deterrence against a nuclear power unless the United States is giving credible security guarantees of its own? Otherwise, the risk of Russian nuclear blackmail is. So I'm just one very quick point. If it may happen, we're in a situation where there is a truce, whatever you want to call it, but where Russia is still in occupation of parts of Ukraine. I really hope that Britain and other Western countries will do what we did after the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states. And even if we just accept the de facto they're running it, we never recognized that conquest as de jure and legitimate. There were Estonian, Lithuanian, Latvian embassies in London right the way through the Cold War until they recovered their independence. And we would need to do the same with regard to Ukraine. What Putin will want is de jure recognition, not just de facto, and he will want the lifting of all sanctions. And there's a really important elements there in any negotiation, which I hope we don't concede.
Emma, can I put a two-finger on that?
Absolutely.
Just to say, I think it's really important not to discount the difference between the Trump administration's approach and strategy and the Biden administration's approach and strategy. I have to say, it is not just a matter of tone and substance. Trump is not ideological about Ukraine. And Biden was the last of the post-Cold War informed, post-World War II informed world US presidents. And yes, they're similar age, but Trump's entire worldview is informed by transactionalism. He is not ideological about, as I said, he's not ideological about Ukraine. That leads you to a different endgame than what you would have seen under a continued Biden administration. The other thing I would just say to David's point about American interests under President Trump are aligned with President Trump's interests. And so I believe that the reason he moved from 24 hours, for example, to 6 months is because he didn't want to take the loss. It's not the loss for US, it's that he got the sense that he was not going to be able to deliver, and perhaps tied to the ability to deliver on the Gaza ceasefire, which there was more clarity around, enabled him to create a more realistic timeline for Ukraine.
I mean, sort of picking up on what Trump wants and who he is. I mean, his comments about Greenland, perhaps during his first administration, might have been the type of thing that everybody laughed about as a sort of, you know, kind of, oh, you know, crazy off the cuff Trump comment. But if you look at it now, I mean, for me, it's interesting we're talking about Ukraine. There's actually echoes of that, if you take it seriously, which many people seem to be doing, of what Putin is doing in Ukraine, right? This idea that might is right, that you can take territory that you want by force. And I just wondered if perhaps you could talk a little bit, Lindsay, about this idea that you've written about of sort of Trump 2.0 and the difference between, you know, I suppose from my perspective, for me, it's just a difference of perception and looking at how the world sees that. But you've written about how in substance, particularly as regards foreign policy, which is what we're talking about here, what's going to affect Europe, you think Trump 2.0 is going to be very different. His idea of what America First was, which was quite isolationist in his first term, is going to be very different in his second term.
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously read quite a bit, as we all have, about Trump 2.0 being unencumbered. I think it's more than that. Trump 2.0, Trump himself is more ambitious on a foreign policy perspective. There is the America First lens through which, branding, I guess you would call it really, which during Trump 1.0 was really about bringing jobs home, keeping jobs, keeping manufacturing back in the US, very much migration and immigration focus. Now it seems from what he's laid out, from Greenland to the Panama Canal to Ukraine to Gaza, that as I was writing about, no stone left unturned, and the hope really for any sort of any country out there is really just not to fall in the crosshairs. I think what I've been saying for 8-9 years now about Donald Trump is when he says something, believe him. I know there is a lot of desire to discount what he says because of the way he says it, because it is chaotic, because it involves capitalizations and funny punctuations, but he does not say things that repeatedly that he does not intend to pursue. The Greenland came up as an idea because of John Bolton, who was in his first administration, but it has lingered with him, and he and those around him now see it not just as a sort of chuckle to rib Europe, but really around ambitions around critical minerals that are going to be in scarce supply globally, and the US-China competition, which is because of the access to rare earths. He sees it as a gateway to the Arctic, which is going to be another key supply chain zone that's going to be coming online increasingly over the decades ahead. And also, fair enough, he is the real estate president, right? So the idea of being able to expand US territory in such a grand fashion, Greenland is enormous. If you haven't looked at the map recently, the ability just to expand US territory in such a grand way hasn't been done by presidents for nearly 100 years. So those are all the factors the lens through which he is seeing it. But I think it's unfair to just see it as unencumbered. I think it is a more ambitious and perhaps instability-driven ambitious agenda that he has in Trump 2.0.
So that takes us very neatly to a question I want to put to David, really, which is, when we talked about before this, can Europe trust Trump? Maybe it'd be better to say, is Europe preparing adequately for a Trump? Does it understand, for a second Trump administration, does it understand what it's facing? I mean, sort of speaking to your point, Lindsay, it's interesting that we've seen European leaders, not just the Danish, taking the comments about Greenland very seriously. So, but overall, David, is Europe prepared? And if not, what should it
Not
do?
sufficiently, in my view. And just to briefly on the Greenland issue, I think it illustrates why it is important to take Trump seriously, but not necessarily literally. Mm-hmm. Because I agree very much with Lindsay's analysis about how Trump and his circles see Greenland, thawing of the Arctic ice sheet, critical minerals, Russian, Chinese naval access into the North Atlantic. And my expectation is, it's conceivable that there'll be a referendum in Greenland that will opt to join the United States. The thought of 2 Greenland senators arriving in DC is a bit interesting. So I don't think they'd settle for Puerto Rico status. But I could see a deal between Greenland, Denmark, US, where there's guarantees about US military bases, about access to raw materials, US companies being given licenses to extract minerals and search for hydrocarbons and so on. So I can see all that happening in a way that would be broadly beneficial, probably to Western alliance interest. I think the big question for Europe is a medium-term one. I think the risk is with Europe. They are doing a lot of thinking about Trump. Without going into detail, I know that Peter Mandelson, has given a lot of thought to this already. I know that Ursula von der Leyen, has been thinking hard about this, and almost certainly will offer Trump, something in terms of the EU guaranteeing to buy more US LNG or to make other concessions. But there's a sort of sense, well, there are 2 years and then the House could flip to the Democrats. It's 4 years and then Trump can't stand again. We can weather this. Whereas I think that, and Lindsay may disagree, but I think that we are seeing a shift in US priorities and attitudes on international policy that you can trace back to Obama, at least on Libya, where he gave a lot of support to the Franco-British military initiative, but he didn't want to take the political leadership on that. He said to Cameron and Sarkozy, you guys have to take political responsibility for this. And I just wonder, and I think it's a serious question as to whether, given where American public opinion is, I know these Europeans have been freeloading on our taxpayers for too long and not taking responsibility, and we're really worried about China. The Indo-Pacific is where the future is. That it's going to be, if not isolationist, a more nationalist US policy, and more like the US in the period before 1941. I mean, why was the US Blue Water Navy created by Teddy Roosevelt? To challenge the Royal Navy in terms of naval supremacy. UK and US nearly came to war amid the US Civil War because Manchester cotton mills were still wanting to import stuff from the Confederacy. So it's not been sweetness and a sort of easy alliance. Is that 1941 to early 21st century period a departure from an older pattern that is now reasserting itself? I simply put the question, but I think Europe is therefore not ready, because I don't think Europe is doing anything like adequate strategic thinking and preparation about how we might up our own security arrangements in a way that both might persuade the Americans better that they should remain invested in us, and that if the worst came to the worst, we have the capability to act, to defend ourselves and our interests, even if the US doesn't want to get involved.
And Mikola, I mean, from Ukraine, you had the experience in a way of being sort of Cassandras to Europe. You were warning from 2014 of the dangers that Russia posed. You were warning Europe. You watched essentially as Europe completely misread its sort of strategic environment, the world political stage. I mean, watching now from Kyiv, how do you feel about really what David's talking about? Like, has Europe learned enough, and is it correcting itself, or do you watch sort of leaders across the continent sort of sleepwalking towards another potentially disastrous situation? Obviously a different, not just about Putin this time, but do you feel the strategic failures for which Ukraine has paid such a high price, the lack of clear thinking, are they still there, or has Europe corrected course at all?
Yes, for me, situation is mixed and picture is mixed, and we receive different signals. Some of them are optimistic, when there are countries which are ready to support Ukraine, even through direct funding of Ukrainian products of military industrial complex, and raising the defense budget and giving some part of it defense budget to Ukraine in this or that way. But simultaneously, yeah, we still see the lack of leadership, a lack of courage to challenge the population to spend more on defense, because now it's obvious that 2% of GDP is not enough. It might have been enough in 2014, maybe before 2022, but now it's not enough. It should be more. And the one thing that is of major concern to me, whether or not the times that Ukraine gained was used in a proper way for the rearmament, for the preparation, because this very pricey time, and when almost 3 years was gained by Ukraine, but Europe is still not producing enough even artillery shells, though it's increased the production, or it doesn't have specific capabilities like air and missile defense, on which it's still dependent on US, which is still indispensable power, indispensable superpower. That's the point of concern. And in general, as for me, there is a lack of understanding, not among all politicians, but among some quarter of the politicians, that after this Russian-Ukrainian war, there won't be states in between in Europe. There would be a dividing line. And in Ukraine, this dividing line would be somewhere clearly demarcated geographically, and this dividing line should be supported by our partners. And it's by our partners to decide where this dividing line between aggressive revisionist Russia and Europe would be, and that's precisely why I welcome this statement that Europeans should preemptively think in advance about bringing their troops, because Ukraine has its limits, demographic limits, economic limits. And if Russia is bringing the third parties, in this case, North Koreans on their side, so Russia is nominally bigger, more powerful, more manpower intensive, and Ukrainian partners are only tentatively thinking about bringing their contingent, their forces after some kind of agreement. So there should be a clear understanding that there would be no states in between, and there would be a dividing line. And it's up to our partners to a great extent to decide where this dividing line would be. I hope it won't be in Polish-Ukrainian border or even Dnipro, because I'm from the Sumy region that is adjacent to the Russia. I hope this dividing line would be as close as possible to the current front line.
I mean, I think I'm very grateful that you brought up the question of the North Korean soldiers, which I think have really underlined from the beginning of this conflict. You know, Ukraine, I think, has been pointing out that this is not just about Ukraine, and that's an argument that I think a lot of people were very resistant to. And you know, you could get used to things so quickly, that the headlines, North Koreans in Ukraine. But if you think about 3 years ago, if someone had said to, I would say, almost anybody in any country who had any interest in international affairs, that there will be North Koreans fighting with Russians against Ukrainians. I don't know if they've actually set foot into Ukraine, but you know, that war, if they're all still in Kursk, everyone would have thought you were completely mad. I mean, it sounds, and I think it just absolutely underlines this point that this war, and you know, to me, they're all linked. I don't know if the others on the panel would disagree, but the risk of nuclear proliferation, the fact that, you know, the North Korean soldiers are being dragged into it, how that connects with China's influence. I'm very aware we want to save time for audience questions because there's a brilliant audience here. So I'm just going to come to one last thing that I wanted to raise with the panel. Maybe I can just touch quickly on different aspects with each one of you. One of the fascinating things of the last sort of few weeks has been the sort of turbocharged alliance between Trump and the sort of tech bros, for lack of a better word. You know, Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, obviously sort of started in a way by Elon Musk. And then we had that extraordinary video of Mark Zuckerberg with a watch that I think cost like $1 million or 10 million, some crazy amount of money, telling everybody that he was ending fact checking. And I think, you know, this interesting alliance of sort of wealth and business. And I wanted to start, David, by just asking you, you know, one aspect of this is the disinformation, the fact checking. You know, the fact checking isn't just about fact checking, it's about moderation. You know, a study by New York University 2020 showed that disinformation spread 6 times faster on Facebook than facts. And Facebook responded to that by cutting the researchers off from their Facebook account. So, you know, I think the sort of fundamental lack of interest in combating misinformation is really profound. And, you know, another example of, and the fact that that's coming to America, which again, leaked Facebook documents 2020 showed that at the time, 90% of Facebook's users were outside America, and it was spending 87% of its moderation money inside America. So the American version of social media is a very highly moderated one. We've seen what happens when it's not moderated, you know, turbocharging genocide in Myanmar, racial violence in Sri Lanka. And the one place, you know, those countries largely don't have the sort of political capital, the funds to stand against these big companies. The one place that has been trying to do that is Europe. And I'm really interested, David, to sort of hear, you know, you were talking about a bit earlier, your take on how this isn't actually just about the internet. How is that going to play out? Europe's attempts to put curbs on these companies, and what is that going to work, and what's that going to tell us about?
I think the jury's out. You know, I think this will be tested, and I think one of the big unknowns about the Trump administration will be whether Musk and his counterparts are successful in enlisting the Trump administration to use the coercive power of the US state through threats of tariffs and other actions to protect the interests of US technology, social media platform. And certainly Musk has said very openly, as has Zuckerberg, they want this to happen, that they regard the imposition of things like age verification, requirements, what we've got in both European and UK law now with prospective penalties that are levied on the internet companies' global turnover or global profits, not just on those in our own jurisdictions, are things they dislike and they want rid of. And can they get the US government to back them on that? I mean, my view is that ultimately, as with the Rockefellers and the Gettys in the late 19th century, or like the press barons, the Northcliffes and the Beaverbrooks and the like in the early 20th century, it is within the power of governments, if they exercise the political will, to constrain them, because they can operate as limited liability companies with the protection that gives in our jurisdictions under a framework of our law. And so, I was heartened when Peter Kyle, the technology secretary, said this week, that the British government is not going to resile from protections of children or the other measures and the penalties that go with that. And I hope that that is a measure of how their position going forward. I think it's not going to be easy, but the tools are there if governments, including EU institutions, have sufficient willpower and are prepared to accept pain that may come as a result of that. I mean, Brazilians were willing to do it, then others could. I mean, personally, I've always found the argument pretty weak that the platform should be treated as just mere display cases and not as publishers, and not without the responsibilities of publishers. They're pretty good at getting their software to find where there's been an alleged breach of copyright and to stamp down on that. So I really am unpersuaded by their arguments. It's all too difficult to do stuff about material inciting terrorism or hatred or child abuse. And I would advocate to my party leadership and to the current British government that they should continue to be pretty resolute on this.
And Lindsay, you've sort of looking at some of the other ventures of these billionaires, Musk with Starlink, particularly in Ukraine, where it played an absolutely critical role. We had Bezos launching rockets today. You've talked about this sort of intrusion of private companies into what had been very much the public sphere. How is that going to sort of develop, under Trump's next administration, and what is it going to mean for sort of foreign policy for Europe? And
yeah, I think as David was saying earlier, we are entering a very different era now, and this is an era where state actors are not the only actors defining geopolitics. If you think about what we've seen over the last year, just even in the Red Sea, where we have Houthi militia who are attacking corporate actors, these are non-state actors with corporate actors defining geopolitics, changing supply chains. And I've been writing about this idea about private sector actors are geopolitical actors now. This is how I've been talking in some of my work over the last year. And it's hypercharged now. I mean, it's absolutely hypercharged with what we're seeing with the Trump administration. Elon Musk is sort of paradigmatic of this example. And now he's not just operating in his private capacity, sort of in a lobbying way or an innovation space where he's putting satellites into space that are enabling, in Los Angeles, the access to internet during these fires or during the war in Ukraine, access to internet for strategic and tactical planning. But now he has got an official capacity within the Trump administration and obviously a clear relationship with the president-elect. So this idea that private sector actors will not only be receiving geopolitics, changes in the world, changes in political dynamics, but actually driving change in the geopolitical landscape is really the moment, the era that we have moved into. Many of us were the beneficiary during the COVID pandemic of vaccines that were privately developed, all the way through now to, as you said, rockets in the sky. And then the future, of course, is in AI. That's all going to be driven by private sector innovation, not by, maybe there's going to be quasi-governmental and relationships, state-owned enterprises, but most of that is coming from and being driven by private sector actors.
Thanks. And just one last question to Mikola before we head out. I mean, perhaps to sort of be a little bit more positive about Europe's power to push back. I think you've had a really interesting thing in Ukraine where actually you've pushed the limits. You know, America and its European allies have sort of said, you know, you can't strike Russia, you can't use our missiles to strike Russia. So, you know, Israel, sorry, I've been working today on the Gaza Strip. Ukraine has, you know, developed its own drones, particularly in the area of drones. When we come to, you know, technology, you've been groundbreaking and you've used them to carry out these attacks. And often they've helped them persuade, you know, the US and its allies to give Ukraine all the weaponry and things you need. And I just wondered, do you have any thoughts about, you know, if you talk about, we talk about asymmetric warfare on the battlefield, but in terms of foreign relations, like, does Ukraine have good lessons for the rest of Europe about how to sort of take on a very powerful US administration and push it towards what you want and need?
Well, such a broad question. Yeah, it's a general.
Keep it short so we can get everyone else.
Well, just 2 points. It's a good sign that Ukraine has an agency and Ukraine has a say, and we're going to develop this say. And luckily, there are countries that are ready to finance it directly. There was a Sweden statement back at the end of the last year that they're going to fund substantially our indigenous missiles. It's a great sign, and it's a good sign that revolution in military affairs, which started in 1970s, 1980s, another one is going on. It's a second edition, which gives opportunity to countries with lesser amount of technologies, lesser amount of money to attain its goals, or at least deny the bigger power the ability to attain its goals. So for the countries like Ukraine, it's a good sign. Yes, it creates some problems, but in general, it can be leveraged. It can be used against bigger powers to create conditions for durable and sustainable peace. So that's how people should interpret, in my mind, Ukrainian successes in long-range firepower. Plus, it's a good counter-arguments to all the Russian unconventional threats. So they didn't breach the nuclear taboo. They threatened to breach numerous times. So it's a good thing to invest also because of this reason.
It's true, actually, we haven't even touched on asymmetrical things in Russia. However, if the audience is interested, this is your chance. So just to say, we are going to take 3 questions at a time. If you want to make comments as well as questions, please keep them brief, because obviously we're mostly here to hear from the panel. So hands up if you would like. I'm going to start with the lady at the back there, please. Yes.
You speak up, please.
I'll try to speak up. Thank you very much, Ellen, panel, and sharing your thoughts and research and you speak quite often to us there. I just wanted to sort of follow up on your statement on Britain's next steps in commitment to security guarantees, and what do you think are the real factors holding the back in sort of stronger committing to the Budapest memorandum with signed? And is there a place among those factors if the Britain's economic collaboration with Russia and possibly Russian frozen assets here or not frozen?
Right. Yeah, so what Mikola, just as you can't hear, I'm going to take all the questions and then do a quick summary for you, just in case you're wondering. Right, other questions here? Right, guy in the blue shirt.
With Europe looking increasingly more isolated from
Would you just introduce yourself if you're happy with that at the beginning?
my name's Pravit and I'm a year 12 student at LAE in East London, and my question regards European arms, because we see how with the Trump administration coming in, Europe looks more and more isolated. So how important do you think the domestic European arms industry is with BAE systems in the UK or Saab or Strauss in Sweden? How important is it to travel domestic production in the future?
Great. And last question for this round, gentleman on the end here.
Okay, what advice would you give to our security services to counter what I would call hybrid warfare? And I'm referring to Peter Jukes and Carol Cadwallader's report on the Russians' links with British politicians. it was about the Tories, sadly, but I wasn't making a political point, but that's just as critical. I think that has undermined, in my view, I think that's undermined lots of things and has maybe affected decision making. So yeah, that's the non-physical warfare. I think that's just as critical. So what should we do about it?
Okay, so we've got 3 questions. The first one is, what should Britain's next steps on commitment to Ukraine's security? It's okay. Just give me time to finish the summary. So that was how you started. You followed up with what's holding the UK back from doing more for Ukraine. The second one is Europe's looking more isolated. And, you know, is there enough commitment to our own arms production? And number 3 is, what should the UK be doing to counter Russian hybrid warfare outside the conventional space of military or even sort of violent attacks, particularly in terms of information warfare, corruption, or even just casting doubts on people's integrity? So I don't know who in the panel would like to jump in. They weren't addressed to any particular members. So David, do you want to start with the first one, or?
No, do you want to?
Let's
run through quickly. I think the record of successive British administrations since 2022 has been pretty good. I think the constraints have been our own defence manufacturing capability. It takes into the gentleman's question here, because we aren't making enough rockets or enough ammunition to replenish our own supplies and to supply additional stuff to Ukraine. What the Ukraine war has shown is that the rate of depletion of armaments is much, much more rapid than our or other Western powers' planning assumptions had been when we've thought about what we would need in the case of war. So what we need to do, I don't think, I mean, I can talk about the Budapest Memorandum, but I mean, that of course did not, it just required consultations amongst members. It was not a security, so like NATO, it was not like NATO Article 5. I think that the best service we can do to Ukraine is to up our own capability for the future. Salisbury in 2018 has demonstrated that we're at risk, not just Ukraine alone. And that takes us to the second question, because that means, the Europeans have got to start thinking more collaboratively. And this will be difficult because it means saying to your national champions in the arms field that, you're going to need to work more with others, and we're going to procure from, a sort of EU plus arrangement, but I think it has to be involving the Americans as well. Let's be realistic and sensible. We want the Americans to stay committed to our security. We can't say we're going to stop buying your kit and stop using your manufacturer. It's often very good.
Well, that would probably upset Trump as well.
Exactly, that's my point. And, so you don't do that, but we need to rationalise and strengthen our defence capability, and it means governments then saying, we're going to, this is where it's difficult politically, we're going to be foregoing expenditure on popular public services, or we're going to be putting up taxes so that we can up our defence spending from, sake of argument, let's say 2.5% of GDP to 3.5%, which I think is where the Trump 5% will probably settle down to in practical negotiations. That's a big ask. That's saying to Rachel Reeves something like another £53 billion that you've got to find for defence expenditure. And you've got to make sure that our MOD is reformed so that they have a procurement programme that actually works and delivers to budget and delivers to timetable, which it is failed to do under successive governments for years now. I think in terms of advice to security services, actually my experience, okay, I'm 5.5 years out of government now, so I mean, my personal knowledge is that rusty, but they're pretty sharp on all of this. And the key thing that I can remember the agents saying to me is that, yes, our defences need to be as good as possible, but Russia and China in particular have extremely good quality intelligence operations of their own. They are working on the really top level, top new technology on cyber, the Chinese in particular, more than the Russians. So it's not, we have to plan on the assumption that they will sometimes get through. Therefore, it's about the resilience of our societies and our critical national infrastructure that matters above all. So that applies to, most obviously, things like GPS systems, communication systems, making them as resilient as possible. So if they are attacked, we have backup or we can recover quickly. But it means things like looking at our electoral system as well. And how do we try and protect the integrity of that? Well, you can't uninvent new technology and digital comms. I mean, you can insist that you vote with a stubby pencil on a piece of paper, which means can't be hacked in the way that online voting could be. So that's just, so resilience as much as defense.
Lindsay,
I
Michael?
can add a couple of comments, but I'll be brief so that we can get to another round. The first is that I think what we've seen with the war in Ukraine, for example, is, and I had opportunity to speak to senior leadership in the US military around this, is that it's the bridge between old conflict and new conflict. And so we have very much on the ground, it's been a on the ground troop battling warfare conflict that required, as David said, so much more resources, military resources than could have been played out, could have been gamed out. But we also are seeing very much at the same time the transition to a more drone-based, more remote-based warfare and conflict system. So I think that's where the resource constraints have come in. I can tell you that the market is pricing in that there will be more investment in domestic European defensive industry, and that I can also imagine that Donald Trump would welcome that as a point of leverage in any sort of negotiations that go forward. And I would just, the last thing I would say is that to what David was remarking on at the end, I've had clients in sort of tech, private sector areas who have said we need to be brought into the wide umbrella around conversations around hybrid warfare. And right now, there isn't an agility between those conversations yet, and we're being boxed out of those conversations in a way that we believe, they believe that they could be useful for.
I mean, I think it's so interesting on the quantity of munitions needed. Everybody, for many years, I would think, thought that North Korea was quite mad. They had these huge stockpiles of sort of slightly decaying shells, which have all come out of their stockpiles and been sent to Russia. And for me, that sort of is a fascinating anecdote of how pretty much everybody except, the guy who people thought was crazy had underestimated how many shells were needed. Mikola, did you have anything you wanted to add on this round, or should we?
Just 2 quick points. So first, we approach the limits of the current model in terms of aid that was adopted in 2022. So here is your weapon to Ukraine and combine it with your own manpower, and this model is not working. So the next step in Western aid should be bringing troops to send the message, and this is at capacity. And this debate should be started, because when the moment would come, if debate is not started, nothing good would happen. That's the first point, how the debate about aid should be approached and should be dealt with. And the second point, yeah, it's about commitment of resources, and it's about increasing production capacity, because now we have a paradox. We have more mature, sophisticated technologies than people 110 years ago, but back in World War I, UK, France, US was producing much more munitions, and it's a kind of a paradox. So we need somehow to address it, maybe through the modern technologies, through the UAVs, lethal UAVs, but it's all about money, it's all about commitment, because 2% it's not enough. Back in 1980s, it was 4 or 5% among NATO countries, and it should be a kind of benchmark, and maybe in the end it would be, as it was said, 3.5%, luckily, of which 0.25 is given in this or that kind of aid to Ukraine.
Thanks. So let's move to the next round. Let's see, we'll start with the lady in the front row. And sorry, last time I was so busy taking notes to remind you, if you're happy introducing yourself, that would be fantastic.
Ursula Woolley, Chair of the Ukraine Institute in London. Can you tell us about the role you think Poland might play, either after a peace in holding the line, the way that David mentioned, or in getting to that peace in exercising leadership in Europe over the coming months and, if necessary, years?
Right, next question. Let's have someone right at the back, the guy with red on his sweater.
Yeah, so North Korea's been
You want to introduce yourself?
North Korea has been mentioned a couple of times, and the role that it plays at the nothing bigger and no people would expect. It seems that Europe would need to have not only a shared approach towards Russia, but also towards countries in Asia, Iran, China in the mix as well in whatever act that Russia is forming. How realistic is that, and how much could it hold back European security?
And last, okay, another guy on here.
You said that if disinformation spreads 6 times quickly on Facebook compared to facts. Given the current state of like polarizing content on the internet, how would you encourage like readers to reconcile between different opinions they've read on different websites and articles, and like had to find the truth in all of that?
Brilliant. So that is 3 really fascinating questions, from very specific about sort of Poland, its role now and in future, to how realistic it is for Europe to improve its, how necessary, but also is it realistic for Europe to improve its shared approach to tackling threats beyond Russia, particularly China, and Iran. Iran's slightly on the ropes at the moment, but yes, definitely very much there. And then sort of moving back away from the sort of military battlefield to broader ones, how to tackle polarizing content and misinformation and the impact that has on sort of electorates, elections, and I'd say indirectly then foreign policy. Who would like to jump in? Lindsay, do you want to go first on this one?
Well, I would just, I think I'm most informed of those questions to speak on the axis of resistance, so-called axis of resistance, however you like to frame it, axis of resistance, North Korea, Iran, and Russia. You know, I think there certainly is a concerted effort for led by Russia perhaps to organize those actors together. But I don't think last year was a great year for that cohort. And in that sense, you know, the Middle East is a very different Middle East than we saw on October 7th. And that's because in part of the degradation of Hamas, degradation of Hezbollah, fall of Assad, Iran has been, as you said, on the ropes, has been shown to be much more precariously positioned than even say 6-8 months ago, when it was pursuing tit for tat with Israel. So for Europe to organize, I mean, the idea that there is a Europe that would be able to cohesively organize around the axis of resistance is incredibly, you know, tricky proposition. The last thing I would just say is that, and David alluded to this earlier, Russia will continue to be in any form related to this war or not, a destabilizing force in geopolitics. And that's what those relationships are fundamentally about. Being able, it's what we saw in Syria when the war there, when Assad was, you know, years ago, it seemed like that his regime was fall, and then Russia and Putin interjected and totally changed the landscape there. So however the Ukraine war resolves, Russia will continue to have ambitions around being a destabilizing actor, which we haven't talked tonight that much about, say, strategic competition with China, but I think that's that is the difference between those two propositions of the competition, the question around Chinese competition with Europe, US-Chinese competition, and the role of Russia and what that as an actor will look to pursue in the world.
Thank you. I mean, Poland, I think, is an example of the way to the rest of Europe. And Poland's increased its defence spending to about just over 4% of GDP. And I saw my old mate Radek Sikorski, the current foreign minister, a few months ago, and he said, you know, we're doing that because we know what Russian occupation is like, and our people would rather eat grass than submit to that ever again. And if the Tusk sort of candidate, Rafał Trzaskowski, mayor of Warsaw, wins the presidential election, that's good news, because the president under Poland's system has particular responsibilities for defence and foreign policy. So actually having a strongly pro-Western sort of president would be a further benefit. But actually, I don't think Duda has done a bad job on that front. But what I would like to see happen, I mean, Poland, therefore, in relationships like the Weimar Triangle with Germany and France can be a really important player in trying to deliver an outcome in Ukraine that is right and helps protect Ukrainian sovereignty and self-determination. I would like to see the UK negotiate the equivalent of the Lancaster House and Saint-Malo treaties we have with France, with Poland. So we have a bilateral arrangement to complement the NATO relationship. And I'd have thought that, if Keir rang me up and asked me, I'd be saying to him, look, get hold of Donald Tusk, go and see him. We have this thing, the Joint Expeditionary Force in Northern Europe, that's very effective defence cooperation, UK, Poland, sort of Baltics, Nordics. What can we make of this? How can we develop this further? How can we start the process in Europe of collaborating better with our defence industries as well as with our armed forces? And don't wait for the Commission. Don't wait for the French to resolve their political crisis. Goodness knows how long that's going to take. Let's use the opportunity with Poland to try and do something there. Not Korea. Well, of course, Japan and South Korea have actually given some support and expressed solidarity to Ukraine. Their ministers have visited Ukraine. I think that there are interesting opportunities to work better with those powers in the Asia Pacific, such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, possibly Philippines, Singapore, certainly. And I would see the Pillar 2 of the AUKUS agreement as an instrument for that. AUKUS has Pillar 1 that's about the nuclear-powered submarines for the Australians. Pillar 2.
Tell people what AUKUS is.
AUKUS,
People know,
yeah,
not everyone.
AUKUS is the agreement that was reached between US, Australia, and UK. Basically, the Australians got fed up with their deal with France to supply them with nuclear-powered submarines, and wanted to switch to the Americans, and we got involved in that as well. So it's a tripartite deal. But Pillar 2 is about cooperation on advanced defence and security technology. And it seems to me there are real advantages if one could bring in Japan, South Korea in particular into that network and share technological expertise with them. And that would be an effective way of improving our general security cooperation. On equipping people to deal with conflicting views, look, we can't uninvent the technology. I mean, the Americans may ban TikTok, and say ultimately, you can outlaw a particular platform. But my experience of my own children, now all adults, is that young people find a way around this. They're always much more adept than their parents or any government regulators are in working out how to use the technology that they want to use. So actually, what you come to is the importance in schools and universities of teaching critical thinking. Actually, making sure people at least have access to the tools to make an informed judgment about the bits of information or disinformation that come before them. And also, I'm quite blunt about this, universities in particular, I think schools too, but universities as well, schools in the senior forms, but universities too, it should be important to have a climate where young people have to engage with ideas and opinions with which they fundamentally disagree. Because one of the consequences of the algorithm is that people are driven into echo chambers, and people can think that the world all thinks as they do. They're on the left or the right or whatever. And actually, bringing people into contact, actually realizing you can have a courteous discussion, even where there are profound disagreements, seems to me absolutely an essential ingredient of a civilized and civil culture.
Can I just follow up on that? I thought it was great you're here and that you're asking these questions. One of the Guardian charities in our Christmas appeal this year, might seem a bit off base, is called Parallel Histories, which is trying to do exactly that. I don't know if your school have heard of them or works. You said you're a year 12, right? Yeah. And they were born out of, in part, teachers trying to teach what's happening in Israel and Palestine, which is obviously all over the news, in people's homes. Of nearly 500,000 British students, I was just looking up the stat before I went to it, who study GCSE or A-level history, only 2,000 of them tackled the conflict in the Middle East in their history. And I think that goes to the heart of, if we are not able to find a way to teach these difficult subjects to students, the vulnerability to radicalization, to misinformation, to all these things is much greater. So I just want to say, I mean, tell your teachers, if it's not at your school, to look up parallel histories, because it's absolutely brilliant. But I mean, we're supporting it, so I have to say that. But I do genuinely think that. We're going to go to Mikola, but I'm just also going to take advantage of my platform just to jump in on China. I lived and worked there for a decade. I'm a Mandarin speaker, and it's one thing we didn't tackle tonight that I think is so important. I think part of our problem in Europe, you said we're well prepared, we understand what's going on in Russia. I actually think as a country, as a region, Europe, but particularly the UK, we are very actually underprepared and ill-informed. If you look at the number of degree courses in Russia-related things, Chinese, the number of specialists, the number of Mandarin speakers, it's particularly serious in the UK. I think America is much better. We are terribly underprepared, I would argue. I think one thing that may be very positive on that front is Hong Kong's tragedy has meant a huge immigration to the UK of brilliant, not all Mandarin speaking, but many speakers, Cantonese speakers who understand China intimately and who hopefully will improve that knowledge. But I think Europe collectively has been much slower to shift away from the sort of what was the dominant geopolitical understanding of China, which was that China's economic development would be twinned with political change that would be positive for us. So it's obviously still economically beneficial for us to engage with China, but for such a long time, there was a sense that it would fuel democracy. And it's clear that that is not going to happen, that China has a completely different political vision. Trump actually forced America to shift that in his first administration, dragged Europe along kicking and screaming a bit, to slightly distance itself and start rethinking. But I would argue that that has not been fully sort of continued in the UK in a way that is progress in America, probably partly because of greater expertise. And I think, again, you look to the lessons of Russia, you think about wars of territory. Xi Jinping's been utterly clear that he wants to retake Taiwan by force. Is watching what's happening in Ukraine very closely. This is not just about China. It's not just about our economic relationship. It speaks to all these questions about the world we live in. So I think that's a really important thing for Europe to think about. And I'm sorry, I know I'm not here on the panel, but I just wanted to jump in. And I'm going to turn, I'm afraid we're nearly at the end, so I'm just going to turn to Mikola to give us the last word, both if you wanted to comment on the last round of questions, but also if there's anything that you think is really important for our audience to take away tonight from Ukraine and from a Ukrainian perspective, because you're at the sharpest end of what foreign policy can mean.
Well, maybe just 2 points, brief one. First, we are in a precarious and a difficult position that can be characterized that we don't have a luxury not to fight, because it's existential war. We already sacrificed quite a lot, but the old approaches are not longer working. So we need to devise something new to bring Russia to the negotiation table and to create a durable peace. And the second point, if Ukraine is sustained for another year and a half, despite all the problems, I think we can create real conditions for bringing Russia to negotiating table and to create some durable framework. So the next 1 year and a half would be really extremely critical. I understand that it might sound weird and familiar because it was said all along, but both countries have some difficulties. I mean, both combatants of engaging more resources. And it's not only about Ukraine, but also about Russia. So please do not lose your confidence and just keep sustaining Ukraine for the sake of everything that was said all these 3 years all along.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Mikola for joining us online, despite the failures of our government in allowing you to be here in person. And thank you so much to David and Lindsay. Everybody's insight and perspective, at least for me, has been fascinating. Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.